welcome everyone. This is a compelling conversation, and I'm your host, Dush Ramachandran. We've got a great show for you today, and we've all heard how Donald Trump is an amazing negotiator. And Corey Lewandowski, who was his campaign manager back in 2016, is reported to have said Donald Trump is the greatest negotiator that this country has ever seen. So I thought it would be interesting to have on the show somebody who knows all about negotiation, has written the book on it, specifically written the book on Donald Trump's negotiation style. So I'd like to welcome our guest today, Martin Latz, who's written the book, The Real Trump Deal. An eye-opening look at how he really negotiates. Welcome, Marty.
Thank you for inviting me. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure. So let's, for the benefit of our viewers, let's start with how you came to be the recognized expert in negotiation as you are. How did you get started in negotiation, and what's brought you to this place?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that we all have been negotiating almost our entire lives.
Sure.
I say in my training programs, we all started negotiating when we were off this tall, working our parents off against each other, negotiating with our siblings, but we tend to negotiate instinctively or intuitively. We tend to sort of do it off the cuff. We tend to sort of wing it. And that's what I did while I was growing up, when I was in college. I went out in the workforce and I came back to law school and I took a course from Roger Fisher, who is the co-author of Getting to Yes, which is really the classic book in the negotiation field, at least for a few more years until my first book, Gain the Edge, is out there a little bit longer. No, seriously, I took this course from Fisher and I thought I was pretty good, right? I mean, I went to a good college, went to Harvard Law School. I thought I was a pretty good negotiator. Well, what I found out was I wasn't nearly as good as I thought I was. And we did a bunch of exercises and I said, hey, there's a lot of research on this. You can learn to be far more effective. And I started studying it. I moved out to Phoenix. I started practicing law. I started teaching negotiation at the law school at Arizona State. And while I was practicing law, I was thinking, this teaching thing, it's really fun. And I started writing on it. I started researching it. And then I left the law practice completely in 1998. I started a business teaching and training people how to more effectively negotiate. And I've been doing it ever since. And I just love what I do. I've researched, as you mentioned, my second book, The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates, came out about 1.5 years ago. And it has really, in many ways, solidified the fact that all of us really need to think about strategically what we want to accomplish in negotiations and not just do it instinctively or intuitively. Because one of the things that even as Donald Trump talked about over the course of his business career, and I studied his 40 years of business negotiating, unbelievably, we know what he did, we know what he didn't do, because he's been involved in a lot of negotiations, and uniquely, he talked about them. He was transparent about them during the negotiations, after the negotiations. So the raw research was just waiting to be analyzed and evaluated from a negotiation expert's perspective. And so I did that. The book came out, and obviously now he's been negotiating as our president for about 3.5 years. And he's doing the same things as president in his negotiations as he did in his 40+ years in business.
Exactly. So this is a great segue into talking about Trump's negotiation style. And you've done an incredible amount of research. You have a lot of data to back it up. And in fact, in your book, I love the way you go through all of his various deals and you set up his sort of, parameters for his negotiating style and how he does things like make outrageous demands and back away from it, sometimes negotiating, perhaps not in the best of faith, etc. But you set the scene so beautifully. So let's talk a little bit about his negotiating style, Trump's negotiating style, first as a business person, as a real estate developer, and then subsequently as president. Now, This is particularly significant now because his negotiations have a far greater impact on not just our country, but the entire world than they did when he was a real estate developer. At best, perhaps at that time, a building didn't get built or didn't get leased or something of that nature, or didn't get sold. But now, you know, with the trade war against China and all of these various things coming up, what can we glean from his negotiating style? What can we learn from that that would be instructive for us in looking at what the future holds for our country?
Well, the first thing I would emphasize is something that came through crystal clear in his negotiations for years and years and years. And he's very open about this strategy and tactic, to the extent that you can even call it a strategy or tactic. But he is a very instinctive human being. He goes with his gut. And even though he talks about using various strategies and tactics, he really makes almost every strategic move in a negotiation, not based on the experts' proven research, not based on what those of us in academics have studied and what we know works, but he just goes on how he feels. He's a very instinctive negotiator. And it's not to say that instincts are bad.
Sure.
Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not so great, but he really doesn't negotiate in a very systematic, disciplined, step-by-step process that takes advantage of all the research that we have done over the years. He just goes with his gut instinct.
Sure.
In terms of whether or not we do the deal or not. And that can be positive if you have great instincts. It can be negative if you don't have very good instincts. In a lot of his business negotiations in real estate, he had really good instincts. I would suggest that as president, his instincts have not been nearly as successful as his business-related negotiation instincts were. And some of his business negotiator-related instincts were great. Others, they were very, very counterproductive. But in that environment, it sometimes worked, it sometimes didn't work. He's had a lot of challenges as president in the last 3.5 years because he really comes at it from a very visceral, instinctive, reactive way, which is particularly problematic when you are not just negotiating on behalf of yourself or negotiating to buy a building or to sell a property. Is particularly challenging when you're leading literally millions of employees and you've got teams of negotiators where they're looking to you for overall strategic direction and you're just going with your gut.
Right. So here's the interesting thing. You make a really good point. When you look at, as a seasoned professional and as a professional negotiator yourself, someone who teaches it and has had years of research behind you, when you look at his negotiating style and you look at the theoretical ideal best practices in certain situations, you probably find some variance. Sometimes his negotiating instinct is right on the money, and he's actually very good at what he's doing in that moment. But other times it may not be. But in his role as the President of the United States, the impact of his negotiation, as we've talked about, has far greater consequence than as a real estate developer or as a business person. Do you feel that the mantle of the presidency has tempered his negotiating style at all? Or do you feel that it's sort of given him more juice, more energy to follow his own instincts in the way he's done before?
You know, it's really interesting that you asked that question, because I actually think that early on in his presidency, he came at it and it was tempered because he was a little bit tentative on his feet. He'd never obviously been president before. He'd never been in any governmental role or negotiated on behalf of any governmental entity, which is very different than negotiating in the private sector, right?
Sure.
I mean, if you're negotiating in the private sector, it's all about, and especially in real estate in New York, New Jersey, and in other countries, it's all about money. It's all about finances. It's all about spreadsheets. And when Trump became president and started negotiating as president, it's really not about the money. It's about issues. It's about policies. You take a look at his first year in negotiating with Mexico over getting them not just to build the wall, of course, but we heard, I don't know how many times during the campaign, he was going to get them to pay for it as well. That negotiation did not go well for him. It wasn't just about money. It was about political components. It was about relationships. It was about a lot of nitty-gritty detail, and he's not a detail person, as he would freely admit. In fact, one of the things that I found in my research is that early on in his negotiations, he did his homework. He did his due diligence. You take a look at his Trump Tower deal. You take a look at his deal for some hotels in Midtown Manhattan. He did his homework. He spent hours and hours and days working with experts and understanding the nitty-gritty details of the deals that he was doing. But then when he got to be a celebrity, he stopped doing his homework. He stopped doing his due diligence. And unfortunately, that has flowed through to him as president. So early on in his presidency, I think he was very tentative in the negotiation area, and he surrounded himself with people, the generals, of course, will recall, and others who would sort of guide him in a lot of ways through some of these international negotiations. And he accepted a lot of that advice. But I think as he's been president now, three and a half years, he has now become very, very comfortable as president, and actually now he's reverted back to a lot of the ways he negotiated before. I mean, he hasn't changed a lot as president, but if you take a look at the trajectory of his negotiation strategies, he was much more reliant on advisors early on, and he is much more free with going with his gut at this point in his presidency than he was early on in his negotiations.
Well, that's really interesting. The other thing that comes up is that from reading your book, the one thing that comes through very clearly is that every negotiation for him is very personal. It's an extremely personal thing. His ego is all bound up in it. So the objective of the negotiation is not just to achieve the end of the negotiation, but it's also an ego satisfaction.
And we can see that reflected in his need to win.
Exactly.
His need to feel like he won any type of negotiation afterward. And you saw that in business for years and years and years. It wasn't just whether or not he made money, it's whether he beat his counterpart.
So would you characterize that as sort of the win-lose style, which used to be called the Soviet-style negotiation back in the day? Would you characterize that as a win-lose style negotiation, where in order for somebody else to, in order for me to win, somebody else has to lose? It's a zero-sum game.
Well, it is. And I think that President Trump's whole mindset is, as I say in the book, he's got a very win-lose mindset, very competitive, very adversarial. This is not about expanding the pie. It's not about finding mutual interests. It's not even about partnering.
Right.
It's really about how can I win as Donald Trump defines a win. So, you know, in real estate, it was, I want to get, if I want this provision, if I get that provision, if I win, if I don't, I lose. It's not about the relationship, because he doesn't define wins by relationship or future relationships. One of the things that you've seen as he negotiated, not only over the course of his business career, but also as president, is he tends to have a very short-term focus. He's not a long-term thinker. And I think he would probably overall agree with that statement. He's not really looking 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line in terms of relationships and the reputation of the United States. He's about what's going to happen next month, what's going to happen in 2 months. How can I get the stock market up next week? Because he defines a win economically as the stock market, which is because in part when he was the head of his public real estate company, or actually it was a casino company, but it had real estate holdings, he defined win by how much money he was making, but also by what happened to the stock price. So he is very transactional oriented in that particular regard.
So then if we look at a transactional sort of style versus a relationship oriented style, where somebody might be willing to concede a point or two, willing to concede on some issues in order to achieve broader consensus, so to build a relationship where you might come back and do another deal another day, where there might be opportunities to build on top of one deal, where you've established trust and you've established some sort of mutual sort of agreement, and then you build on top of that in future deals. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't, again, in the way you describe it in the book, that doesn't appear to have been his focus. His focus appears to have been, and probably still is, very transactional. It is deal by deal by deal. If I win this deal, that's great. If not, that's a very bad thing. And I got to figure out a way to make this a win.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And you can see that, by the way, he's a very personable individual. And you can see when he meets with other world leaders, he's oftentimes, he really does try to find common interests and build those rapport. He knows the importance of the relationship, but he really only cares about that relationship in a short-term context as it relates to the deal that's on the table. So you don't see him developing those longer-term relationships with Angela Merkel in Germany,
sure.
Or some of the other world leaders. Now, he will say nice things about them if they say nice things about him,
right?
And if he sees that he can get his interests satisfied in that regard. But you'll see his focus. And by the way, this is not just me reaching that conclusion. He had, in his real estate career, he was involved in over 4,000 pieces of litigation. Now, I know lawyers who've been practicing their entire lives who have not been involved in 4,000 pieces of litigation. Almost all of his deals were subject to litigation, in part because he cared about the relationship when it helped him. But at the end of the day, if he had a subcontractor and they had performed and he still owed them money at the end of the deal, the performance had already concluded, he would oftentimes pay them less than what he contractually owed, knowing that they either are going to walk away and say it's not worth it to fight, or if they fight, the higher lawyer they litigate, he's going to end up paying them off with a lot less than he owed, because that's just the nature of our litigation system.
Sure.
And it wasn't worth their time and their effort and their money to go all the way through and even, try to get attorney's fees, which usually didn't happen anyway. So he could pay less, but at the cost of that relationship, because obviously he's not going to be using that subcontractor anymore. And
the subcontractor probably would not want to be working with that organization anymore anyway. So
that's right.
The cost of that relationship, I guess, was perceived as being minimal. He perceived that cost to be worth it.
Well, that's right. And we've seen that also manifest itself now on the international stage, because there has been really no collaboration, no leadership with other countries in addressing this crisis. Just for example, obviously there was a significant shortage in personal protective equipment, in gowns, in masks, in ventilators, in gloves. And so instead of a coordinated global response to maximize the production, what have we seen? We have seen a dog-eat-dog world out there. Exactly. Where the federal government is trying to buy this stuff, states are trying to buy this stuff, hospitals are trying to buy this stuff, Other countries are trying to buy this stuff because they've got a shortage. And so we haven't had any type of coordinated effort in this regard. And it's been absolutely disastrous for all of these entities to compete with each other. The only ones who are winning here are the suppliers. But
right.
the buyers could have coordinated overall, created leverage, and really gotten the resources and the materials where they needed to be, instead of just letting everybody out there in a Wild West environment to try to get whatever they can get and to pay premium prices for it.
Yeah, exactly. So let's turn to the upcoming elections. We're just about 6 months away from the elections, and given Donald Trump's negotiating style and what we know of his historical performance with respect to negotiating in a variety of environments, how do you think his style will be reflected in the way he positions himself as a candidate, whereas as an incumbent candidate for the presidency?
Well, I think he's going to be consistent. I mean, he's been consistent over his entire life in terms of projecting a sense of confidence, a sense of expectation, and projecting the perception that, as Corey Lewandowski said, he's the greatest negotiator that this country has ever seen. But what's different this time around versus last time around is that one thing that everyone knows and everyone agrees, if you love him or you hate him, you know that he is a master promoter. He's a master salesperson. And he created an incredible brand over many years that gave him leverage in the negotiations. But what we have seen now in the last 3.5 years is his negotiation style laid out for the entire country and world to see. So I think it's going to be far more difficult for him to project the image of the greatest negotiator, because we've seen, for instance, that we don't have that deal with North Korea, right? I mean, we've had
right.
2, 3 summits. We really haven't had any progress. Now, we haven't had war, and he likes to say that had he not been elected president, we would have been at war with North Korea. That's what he says. Obviously, President Obama or Hillary Clinton would disagree with that. But we haven't seen a deal on North Korea. We've got a new NAFTA, and he doesn't need to be given credit for that. Although how good a deal that is subject to some dispute. But we don't have a great deal with China yet. Now that's ongoing. We have a phase 1 deal. We don't have anything beyond that. And we've seen a lot of people hurt based on his negotiation strategy from a trade perspective, right? I mean, farmers throughout the country have been hurt substantially. There has been a lot of bailouts of farmers, and there have been a lot of trade-related problems in our economy, obviously, in that context. So we now know to a much greater degree how he negotiates and whether he's been successful in negotiating as president. And I think that is going to be evaluated by people this time around, whereas when he was running in 2016, they basically went on the perception
right.
Of Corey Lewandowski and of his book, The Art of the Deal. Well, we've got a lot of evidence now that perhaps that wasn't the case.
Well, and then we still don't have the wall paid for by Mexico, one of the many tentpoles of his campaign. The wall hasn't been built, mainly because, Mexico hasn't paid for it, and they will never pay for it as far as we can see.
Well, and if you take a look, I mean, it's not just the wall in Mexico. I mean, a fundamental tenet of his election campaign was we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare.
Yes, exactly.
And obviously, in his first year with the famous or infamous thumbs down from John McCain in the Senate, you know, he didn't get anything done on Obamacare. Now he's still trying to get rid of Obamacare in the courts, but that really doesn't have any reflection, or it doesn't suggest any reflection of his negotiation skill and strategy. And
Right.
you've seen very few deals overall that he's been able to get through Congress in that reflect excellent negotiation strategy. He got his tax cut through, but of course at the time he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate. Now that you've got a Democratic House, you've basically got very little done across the aisle, despite his rhetoric during the campaign that he would be able to really sit down and do deals with Democrats and Republicans and bring them together.
Right, right, exactly. So this has been an absolutely fascinating read. Let me hold it up. It's an amazing book, and it's available wherever books are sold. Marty, is that right?
That's correct.
Available on barnesandnoble.com, amazon.com. The book is The Real Trump Deal, an eye-opening look at how he really negotiates. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. This has been really illuminating. And let us know if you're going to be writing another book. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you. I very much appreciate being here.
Wonderful.
Stay safe.
Thank you. You too.